Welcome into the Andrew Garrison Show. My name is Andrew Garrison, speaking to you from a bedroom in central Indiana. It's episode number 18 of the Andrew Garrison Show. I appreciate you a great deal for tuning in, whether or not you are watching or listening, either watching on YouTube or listening on Spotify. We have a lot to talk about today. There is plenty to discuss in the sports world, particularly in the IU sports world, which is where we're going to start this conversation at the very top. A little bit later on, we're going to talk about the World Cup. The theme of this show is sort of topics that are relevant to the last couple of weeks, but I have not yet spoken about them on this show or spoken about them at all in the case of the World Cup topic. Both of the IU topics, the IU football topic, we're going to talk about Curt Cignetti's recent recruiting success, obviously bringing in Monshun sales, which at this point is old news, and I've discussed that other places, but I haven't talked about it on this podcast yet, and I'd love to. So we'll talk about that, particularly because Lukas Prock, four-star QB from New Jersey, just committed to Indiana. He's in the 2028 class, so he'll land on campus in Bloomington a little bit later on in his career, or a little bit later on in time, I suppose, even. But nonetheless, that's a huge commitment. So we're going to talk about IU football's recruiting success. We're going to talk about some takeaways from IU men's basketball's trip to Peru, sort of those international matchups, right? You look at Indiana representing Team USA in the FISU America Games, at least the basketball competition of those games. It's sort of like a North America, Central America, right? The Americas University Olympics almost. There's a ton of different events, there's a ton of different sports, but they're all represented by collegiate athletes and students, right? So that's Indiana men's basketball is representing Team USA in that event. We'll talk about some takeaways from the Indiana men's basketball team from the two games they've played so far. They played one game at the time of recording this in the actual tournament against Peru, and then they had an exhibition matchup against Canada a little bit earlier on in the month of July that I want to discuss as well because I was there in person. And again, a lot of this is old news, and if you follow me on Twitter, Instagram, whatever, you've probably seen a lot of my thoughts on these things. My thoughts are going to be constructed a little bit differently and conveyed a little bit differently on this podcast because it's a completely different forum, right? When I'm writing, you have to be a little bit more factual. Not obviously, I'm factual in this podcast too. It's a bad way to word it, but you have to be. It's more journalistic, right? It's more methodical, right? You have to really think through the words that you're writing. Whereas here, I can kind of go on tangents and side anecdotes of some experiences that I had that are compelling through the spoken word, but not compelling through the written word. I don't need to over-explain that concept to you. But regardless, I want to sort of bring up some of the things and talk about some of these things in a little bit of a different way on this podcast, both with IU football and IU men's basketball. And then we're going to talk about Spain winning the World Cup and kind of my interesting perspective on that might be different from a lot of the perspectives you're hearing other places, and then also preview the Women's World Cup in 2027, which I think will be a lot of fun. First of all, of course, the drink of choice today is a strawberry peach LaCroix, if you're watching on YouTube. That's what's in the small little glass over here. I went on Crimson Cast yesterday to discuss IU men's basketball. It's one of the places that you could find my thoughts on the Peru trip so far for that team. So I went on the Crimson Cast podcast yesterday. I recommend you go find that. Me and Galen Clavio had a great time, but I felt really insecure while we were recording because, and if you're watching on YouTube, you can see, but I put a little ice in this glass and then I pour the sparkling water in, typically LaCroix. And I had one piece of ice that was protruding out of the top, which just, I don't know what it is exactly, what the diagnosis is, or I guess lack of diagnosis, because there isn't a diagnosis for me in my brain that leads me that to bother me so much. But there's just one piece of ice that was like borderline hitting my nose while recording, while I was, tipping my glass back to get a quick refreshing sip of water, I suppose sparkling water. And I think that's rather funny. Obviously, today it's totally fine. All the ice is sitting there within the brim underneath the brim of the glass. And that's exactly where we want to be. So it's going to be a great show. Once again, other places you can find my thoughts on IU football and IU men's basketball so far. Obviously, I cover IU football for the Hoosier Network. Most people watching this probably know that. I wrote about the program effect overall of the Monshun sales commitment, pipelines, avalanches. We'll talk about some avalanches here on the podcast. I wrote about that for the Hoosier Network. I'm really proud of it. I kind of really like it. It's the most recent post on thehoosiernetwork.com, at least at the time of recording this. So you should be able to find it rather easily if you're interested in reading my thoughts on that. I also discussed the Monshun sales commitment in a live instant reaction podcast with Brooks White, our guy, Brooks White, friend of the program right here, on the ABCFB podcast. That's the one that we co-host together. We did an instant live reaction to the Monshun sales commitment when it happened, and you have a lot of my quick, instant thoughts on that. I guess that's exactly what it is, an instant reaction. And on the IU men's basketball side, find Crimson Cast on Substack. I write for Crimson Cast there. You can also find the post-game pod on Assembly Call on YouTube, where we discussed the game against Canada from back on July 15th, if you want to go back and find that. And then also, of course, yesterday on the Crimson Cast YouTube channel, discussed the trip to Peru so far for Indiana men's basketball there. That's all I have to say about that. Let's move on and actually talk about what I want to talk about, and specifically today, that is IU football's recruiting success, right? Because last week we saw, or roughly last week, we saw Monshun Sales, the number one receiver in the country, or the number two receiver in the country, depends on who you ask, depends on where you look. He goes to Lawrence North High School here in Indianapolis. The address is Indianapolis, I believe, for Lawrence North High School. But regardless, Indianapolis area, the greater Indianapolis area, he goes from Lawrence North to Indiana. And that is instead of all of the countless, numerous, various other options that he had, not only in colleges across the country, but elite programs across the country in the football department. So he chose Indiana. That's a huge, huge deal. Obviously, Kurt Signetti has a great deal to do with that. But as Sales said on the Pat McAfee show, where he announced his commitment last week, he said that Indiana was the second team to offer him, right? The second school to offer him, a spot on the team. And Indiana has been there the whole way. And so sort of that loyalty and the devotion to its recruits is one of the reasons why Indiana is succeeding. Lukas Prock also had Indiana, right there along with every other school the entire way. So both of them experienced that loyalty and that devotion from Indiana, which is very important in both of their recruitments. Now, Sales chose IU. He's staying home in Indiana, which, again, is a very, very big deal because most recruits that are at his level in Indiana, I shouldn't say most, I guess I haven't looked at the numbers, but a great deal of recruits that are at his level will, occasionally stray elsewhere and find their way at different schools across the country. Caden Curry is a great example. He went to Ohio State, right? Great, went to Center Grove, great defensive lineman. He's now in the Indianapolis Colts. That's a recent example of someone who's played high school football in the time period that, he was in high school when I was in high school. At least there's some overlap there. Obviously, he's on the Colts now, and I'm still in college, so it's not like we're the same age. I believe he was a senior in high school when I was a freshman. I remember because I went to Carmel High School, and our teams played each other that year, as they do most years, besides that little brief blip where they weren't against each other for a while, because of, various factors outside of the player's control and the coach's control. But regardless, Caden Curry really just decimated that Carmel team, and Center Grove as a whole decimated that Carmel team. I don't remember the final score, but I know Center Grove won by a lot. That's a great example. Caden Curry, I don't remember where he was ranked in terms of the recruiting rankings at that time, but he's a great example of someone who is an elite talent in Indiana who goes out of state, right? And I'm not certain, but I imagine if Caden Curry was a senior in high school right now, for example, or someone like him, for example, maybe it definitely would be way more realistic and reasonable to suggest that player, whoever that nameless, faceless, 5-star, 4-star is, that player could go to Indiana. That is a totally more feasible option now, as evidenced by the commitment of Monshun Sales. He's staying home. He's staying in state. He's going to play at Indiana. And the effect of that is twofold, really threefold. Obviously, the first effect is fundamentally Monshun Sales is going to almost inevitably be awesome, right? He's going to make a great deal of plays on the field. I really like his speed and his creation and his ability to create space from defenders, particularly in the downfield direction. But what I like even more than that, and I think part of the reason why he's a 5-star, is that even if that plan A doesn't succeed and the defender is right by him, right, especially against elite defenders, or in this case, especially against defenders at the Power 4 level or potentially at the top 25 level in college football, when he gets to that point, obviously he's still got to play his senior season at Lawrence North, and then he'll be in Bloomington in 2027. But even if he doesn't have that space and the defender is right next to him, you still see Sales have the catch radius and the wingspan to catch the ball over, around, through a defender, right? That seems to be exactly the type of plays that he's capable of. And as I said on the ABCFB podcast with Brooks, I can totally imagine Monshun Sales, on a corner route in the end zone. He's on the back pylon and he catches the ball over his defender's head and he gets his feet down, right there at the back of the end zone, and it's a touchdown for Indiana in a critical moment in a big game. I can totally see that happening at some point in Sales's future. He commits to Indiana. So that's number one. That's the one impact. The second impact, more long-term, is the creation of a pipeline, the manufacturing of a pipeline. There's already a pipeline from Lawrence North to Indiana, right? Omar Cooper Jr., as some people may not know, went to Lawrence North High School. Davion Chandler, who is currently on the roster as a receiver for Indiana, went to Lawrence North High School. Donovan McCauley has also been on the Indiana roster in the past. He went to Lawrence North High School. I think he was actually a quarterback for Lawrence North, and then he ended up as a receiver at Indiana. But nonetheless, and there are more. There are more examples, but even just an LN receiver pipeline to Indiana and you know, a pipeline across the board of great Lawrence North prospects to Indiana. Lawrence North really churns out great receivers year after year, you know, cycle after cycle, and a lot of those great receivers end up in Indiana, right? Whether it's because they didn't have quality offers out of state, or because in Monshun Sales' case, and probably more cases, he's so great, he has offers from everywhere. He's, you know, a top receiver in the country, but he still chose to stay home and go to Indiana. And that's a phrase, that's a sentence that may not necessarily ring true for every single five-star prospect in Indiana history, right, in IHSAA history. As a matter of fact, it rings true for none of them, because this is the first five-star that Indiana has ever successfully recruited. They bring in Monshun Sales. That's a very, very big deal. So there's that wide receiver pipeline, and I'm not even just talking about top elite receiver talent or top Indiana talent. Now, both of those categories could be described as a pipeline, because also you have you know, the top receiver, you know, the second best receiver in Indiana for this class in 2027 from Brownsburg is going to Indiana University as well. So there's that, but then also separately from that, not only is Monshun Sales the top receiver in Indiana, as previously mentioned, he's the top receiver in the country, right? So you have, or the second one, if you want to say Easton Royal, who's committed to Texas, is better, that's fine. I'm not really interested in arguing about who the best receiver, who the best high school receiver in the country in this recruiting class is. They're both awesome. They're both going to be awesome. And the effects of both of their commitments are, you know, relevant to all of these three, you know, different avenues of impact that I'm speaking about right now. It doesn't detract from Sales at all to say that Easton Royal is great. It doesn't really matter to me who you think is better. But regardless, Sales a top receiver in the country who has as many options as anybody, right? A five-star with as many options as anyone in the country chose Indiana, and that could signal to two categories of great elite talents across the country. The first is just wide receivers, simply to the point where Indiana could become a wide receiver university, as it's called, right? WRU. And right now, I think that crown goes to Ohio State, and there are other examples. But every single year, it feels like Ohio State is churning out a first-round draft pick, if not a top 10 draft pick in the NFL draft every single season. There are some years where they even have two. I believe over the course of the last 5 NFL drafts, there are 6 Ohio State receivers that went in the first round of the NFL draft. There's 6 because Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, if I'm not mistaken, were drafted the same year. Maybe that's wrong, but regardless, every single season there is a top receiver, whether you look at Marvin Harrison Jr., right, whether you look at Garrett Wilson, whether you look at Emeka Ibuka. Ohio State is known for taking top talents at the receiver position and turning them into first-round draft picks, and so that's a very safe option for these recruits across the board. Monshun Sales is an example of someone that Ohio State was interested in, but still, Sales chose Indiana. Now, Indiana also, this also all falls under the context that Indiana also sent a receiver in the first round of the NFL draft. That was Omar Cooper Jr., who, if my memory serves, went 13th in the NFL draft this past spring. So Indiana also, granted, it's not like it's necessarily a multiple-year run like with Ohio State, but they're starting what could be a multiple-year stretch of sending receivers in the first round of the NFL draft, right? We just saw them put Omar Cooper Jr. in the draft. Maybe Nick Marsh goes at some point. Maybe Charlie Becker goes in the first round of the NFL draft at some point. We'll have to see how their careers pan out and their seasons pan out this season. But it's very possible that Indiana strings together multiple seasons of putting a number one receiver in the NFL draft. Now they have a top 2 receiver in high school landing on campus who is certainly going to be capable of receiving a similar achievement or achieving a similar goal of being, you know, a first round pick in the NFL draft. So potentially this is the making. This is the fact that, and obviously these are not completely independent events. I'm sure that part of Monshun Sales' decision to go to Indiana has to do with the success of Elijah Surratt and Omar Cooper Jr. and the other receivers who, you know, were either drafted or are now relevant in NFL conversations, and the fact that Nick Marsh, you know, a top transfer, you know, prospect in the country, ended up at IU as well. and also Charlie Becker really emerging out of nowhere as an awesome player. Sales won't emerge out of nowhere. We know he's an awesome player. We just have to see him actually do it. And obviously, all signs point to the fact that, or point to the idea that he likely will find that success at Indiana. But this could be a start of a wide receiver pipeline where the top receiver recruits in the country, not just in Indiana, right? Not just great players at Lawrence North, but separate from Lawrence North and separate from Indiana, the top receiver recruits in the country are at least going to give Indiana a second look. And that could be enough to really create a pipeline, especially if Sales goes through his college career and becomes an Indiana legend and goes in the first round of the NFL draft and has a great NFL career. Same could be said for Omar Cooper Jr., who's already in the NFL and looking to do great things with the Jets. Regardless, that's a pipeline. So we have the impact on the field, which is the first impact, and obviously the most direct one to this commitment. The pipeline is important. And then there's the avalanche. And this is what's more important in the short term for Indiana. And I think this Lukas Prock commitment is evidence of the existence of this avalanche, because no one wants to be the first 5-star to commit, right? No one wants to be the first 5-star to make the decision to, commit to a school that's largely unproven, right? Because if you're Monshun Sales in the situation, maybe playing time is a part of the conversation, but Ohio State consistently turns top talents at the receiver position into great players at the NFL level, even, right? Year after year. Emeka Egbuka's thriving with the Buccaneers, right? Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Marvin Harrison Jr., all these players are true names. They're people that you look for when you're drafting your fantasy team. And Monshun Sales could become that at Ohio State, theoretically. Obviously, maybe he agrees. Maybe he doesn't. Obviously, something in him decided to go to Indiana instead of Ohio State. And Ohio State wasn't the only player in this game, right? Alabama was another one that was a true finalist. Texas seemed to be a finalist as well. And Indiana ultimately won the race for Monshun Sales. And Indiana could become that as well with the wide receiver position and with Sales, potentially traversing through his college career and ending up in the NFL. But separately from that, to see the top receiver recruit in the country, even beyond that, to see one of the top recruits in the country across the board, one of those top players, a 5-star, commit to Indiana. The first 5-star in program history signals to all the other 5-stars, no matter what the position, that maybe Indiana is a destination for top talents. Obviously, the national championship helps with that a lot. Obviously, having the number 1 pick in the NFL draft helps with that a lot, as well as many other first-rounders. And obviously, this Curt Cignetti turnaround has turned heads really since he arrived, since that opening press conference, right? And since he was standing on the floor of of Assembly Hall saying all that he said about Michigan, Ohio State, and of course Purdue as well. So there's the avalanche of talent that could occur as well, where everyone's considered, and I shouldn't really generalize that way, but it's reasonable to suggest that since the national championship run and even since the playoff run a year ago, 5-stars or 4-stars or blue chip recruits have at least considered Indiana and thought about Indiana a little bit more than they would prior to Cignetti's arrival. But now it's clear that something has shifted to where now Monshun Sales a 5-star. Again, a national championship helps, the number 1 pick in the NFL draft. I'm not going to act like it's just a mysterious, I wonder what happened. I wonder what changed. But it's true that there was a time when no one was committing to Indiana if you were a 5-star. And now at least one 5-star has, and I think that could cause a short-term avalanche of blue chip talent all in a line, one right after the other, committing to Indiana. And really trying to make Indiana a destination for top talent, because clearly you can win a national championship. You can be drafted in the first round. Curt Cignetti is capable of winning championships and developing great players, right? And in that, the rest of that staff as well, of course, right? Shanahan and everyone else on that staff that plays a role in these players' development. It's clear that Indiana is capable of turning great talents into great pros, potentially, or at least, maximizing the opportunity for that to happen, and also will win games and win championships along the way. So that's exactly where you want to be, right? That's obvious. Indiana's a great place for anyone that wants to have a great college career or to play college football and do so successfully. Obviously, Indiana is looking like a great place, but now 5-stars have evidence that someone, and this, Monshun Sales' opinion is a very valid one, considering how highly touted of a prospect he is. Someone believes in Indiana, so much so that they will commit, obviously with the transfer portal it's different, but they will commit the start of their college career to that school. And if Sales stays, and if Sales, again, becomes an Indiana legend and then goes to the NFL and has a great NFL career, then in the short term and the long term, that could create an avalanche of talent to where this is just the ignition, right? This is just the start. it was probably considered in the minds of a lot of top recruits and a lot of top talents to go to Indiana, even if Indiana wasn't a finalist or even if it was barely thought of compared to some of the other programs or the programs they actually ended up committing to. But now that someone has finally done it, not only that, the top or second best receiver in the entire country has done it. I think that's going to make it much more likely that 5 stars and 4 stars across the country commit to Indiana. Lukas Prock is an example of that, in my opinion. He's a 4-star quarterback from Princeton, New Jersey. He went to Hun School. He plays against a lot of, like, a national schedule against a lot of top high school and academy programs. Again, a 28 quarterback, so he started as a sophomore last year. Stats were awesome. I don't necessarily want to go over his physical characteristics in those stats because those are going to change and be updated before he arrives on campus, right? Because he's still got his junior and his senior season left to play. But Indiana beat out Notre Dame, Ohio State, Michigan, among others. Those are some of those programs that Indiana is competing with the most regionally. Obviously, Ohio State and Michigan, historically, 2 of the stronger teams in the Big Ten. Also, along with Indiana, 2 of the 3 teams that have won a national championship in the last 3 years, all of which, of course, from the Big Ten. And then Notre Dame is obviously that main recruiting target, that main recruiting competitor in the state of Indiana. Purdue doesn't play as much of a role with some of these top talents, and neither do the group of 5 or the other schools. It's really Indiana and Notre Dame. Indiana wins this battle against Notre Dame, and that's a really big deal as well. Also, obviously, Indiana lost to Notre Dame in the college football playoff a couple years ago, which is noteworthy in its own right, considering that sort of regional rivalry. So, again, there were more programs involved with Prock, but ultimately he chose Indiana over those regionals who were those regional rivals who were in his top 5, which I think is a big deal as well. He's super talented. He seems super smart. He seems super aware. He runs a rather, at least according to the 24/7 Sports scouting report, he runs a rather complicated offense for his level at Hun School and seems to do so rather successfully. Seems like he's great at all 3 levels, fitting the ball into tight windows. Seems like he's not going to make very many silly mistakes. That's kind of like what we saw from Mendoza during the playoff run. Reminds me of him. He's comfortable under pressure. He's able to execute under pressure. I think the quote in the 24/7 Sports recruiting profile is within structure and out of structure. He's able to, I suppose I should say paraphrase. I don't know if that's a direct quote, but the paraphrasing of that is within structure and even out of structure, right? If the pocket collapses or something like that, he's still able to make plays happen on all 3 levels of the field. That's the type of maybe not superstar, but just talented, aware, smart, intelligent, successful. Talented is really the greatest word I could use to describe it, especially for someone so young. That type of quarterback that can really carry a team to a championship, for example, or carry a team to the next level. You think of those meaningful moments like Fernando Mendoza and that run and dive in the national championship game against Miami for a touchdown on 4th down in a pivotal moment. You think about the throw to Omar Cooper Jr., right? These are the type of plays that I'm looking a little bit too far ahead. Obviously, this guy's in the class of 2028, so it's not like he's the most polished, finished product in the game, but I think this is a major commitment, and I think that if he continues to sort of maintain his commitment to IU throughout his college career, I think that he could be capable of really making some noise and making a great deal of good occur in Bloomington and sort of continue that string of great quarterback play at Indiana University. Quarter's work was great. Fernando Mendoza was much better. We'll see if Josh Hoover can match that. Even if he doesn't, he will probably be very, very good. And then whoever's after that, right, we'll just continue this sort of conveyor belt, right? Continue this line of great quarterback play at Indiana University. And I think Lukas Prock has a chance to continue that. So IU football is recruiting very, very well. Obviously, the Sales and Prock commitments illustrate that. It's not a surprise necessarily that the reigning national champions are recruiting well on the recruiting trail. Not a surprise that Cignetti is doing well in that way, especially after his success in the transfer portal this past cycle. But it's still noteworthy. It's still the big deal. It's still very important to the long-term success and health of this program. And clearly, of course, the Hoosiers are here to stay. All right, let's talk about Indiana men's basketball. I'm going to take a sip of this sparkling water real quick. I struggle with, I'm much better on this show when I have a guest because I can take a pause to breathe. I can take a pause to take a sip of this drink. I feel like I'm always out of breath. I haven't figured out my pacing on a podcast quite in the way that I would like to, but that's why we do it each and every week to really make this become the best it could possibly be. I'm going to take a quick sip of this sparkling water. We'll talk about Indiana men's basketball. All right, let's talk about Indiana men's basketball. Indiana played against Canada, obviously representing Team USA on July 15th. They also played against Peru in their first game of the FISU America Games just a couple nights ago on Tuesday night. It's now Thursday, and it's 2:30 p.m. at the time of right now as I'm recording this. And in just a few hours, they'll play against the Virgin Islands in their second and final group game at that tournament. More than likely, USA will advance and play in the knockout stages over the course of the weekend. I think that this team, this Indiana roster, is going to cruise through this tournament, maybe until it faces Argentina. Argentina, just to sort of tour back on these results. Argentina blew away Brazil, if I'm not mistaken, and Chile, I have it wrong. Argentina blew away Colombia, and then Chile blew away Brazil on the first night. And then on the second night, Argentina beat Brazil by a lot, Chile by a lot. So the team that Argentina already proved that they can decimate Colombia. And then Chile already proved they can decimate Brazil. And if you believe in the transit property, Argentina also destroyed Chile. So chances are when Argentina plays against Brazil, as they probably already have today, Argentina is also going to win by a great deal of points then. And so then when we get to the knockout stages, maybe Argentina is the team that poses the most of a threat against this Indiana roster and Team USA. The Virgin Islands also could be that team, or probably not, though. The USA beat Peru 115-36, and the Virgin Islands notably beat Peru 93-73. So chances are that game will be a little bit closer tonight. We'll find out. I'm going to be at the City League, my semi-pro community basketball internship, or the league that I am a broadcast intern for in Indianapolis tonight. So I'm not going to be able to watch the game live, but I'll watch it after the fact and then write up my 5 takeaways for Crimson Cast, and those will be uploaded sometime early in the morning. So I won't see it live, but I'll be able to see the game after the fact once I get home later on tonight. So that will be very fun and interesting. But some takeaways so far for this Indiana men's basketball team. I'm just going to run through the 10 takeaways that I wrote down for Crimson Cast. Obviously, I've spoken about these on both the Crimson Cast podcast, the Assembly Call podcast, and obviously through writing with those Crimson Cast takeaways on the Substack. You can find both of these articles in full if I describe it a little bit better, a little bit more thoroughly there as well. Obviously, we've seen Indiana with its 2 big lineup for the first time. Really for the first time. This is Aiden Sherrill and Samet Yigitoglu. Yigitoglu is not competing in Peru, but he was in the game in the exhibition. And it's nice to see those 2 bigs together for the first time, right? And you can kind of tell that Indiana is obviously putting more emphasis on the front court in terms of its roster construction, in part because the Big Ten is full of beasts, right? The Big Ten is huge. There are plenty of players in the front court that are great. Obviously, we saw even just last season, the best team in the Big Ten, probably the national champions, Michigan, had Yaxel Lendenborg and Adai Mara both in the front court a lot of times together. So it's important to have 2 bigs in the game together in case you're facing a lineup like that one. That's what Indiana has now with Sherrill and Yigitoglu. So that was important to see. And Yigitoglu is less mobile, right? And that's what I wrote about. I got a profile piece coming out on Crimson as well in just a moment on Yigitoglu. The Sherrill one came out a week or 2 ago. But Yigitoglu is less mobile, but he's 7'2", right? And he's huge down low, and he has great rim protection abilities, obviously, and also is a great rebounder and scorer between the blocks. He's kind of that true traditional center, whereas Sherrill can really stretch the floor. And that's what we started to see last night in that game against Peru. And remember, Sherrill was really playing the 5 for a lot of that game. And the broadcast quality was rather choppy, so it was really difficult to really see much in the way of what was going well and what wasn't going well for Indiana, in Team USA in that game. But either way, Sherrill at the 5 really dominated, and they had distinct size advantages in both the game against Canada and the game against Peru, and that's important to note. It's not going to be this easy ever again, right? Sherrill's never going to have that throughout the rest of the calendar year. Sherrill is not going to have that easy of a time scoring at any level of the floor, just because Peru's players and Canada's players much smaller, much less physically formidable compared to Indiana's roster. And so that obviously has a lot to do with the fact that Indiana won. Their Team USA won 115-36. Obviously that size and that physical disparity and advantage has a great deal to do with that. But nonetheless, Sherrill clearly can stretch the floor. He was hitting triples on the outside. He had the dunks down low. He had some great second chance buckets that I really liked. He had some great rim protection and block moments. Again, it's never going to be that easy. Again, maybe in this tournament it'll be easier against the Virgin Islands or whoever this team faces in the knockouts, but undoubtedly it won't be this easy by the time Indiana reaches Big Ten play a little bit later on in the fall and the winter. But that two big lineup seems to work, even if there's not two bigs, even if it's just one of them. There seems to be some success there as well. The one thing about Yucatolu that sometimes is indicative of struggles is when he is there, he's alone in the front court. He's alone between the blocks by himself. And if this is what Canada did a couple times, they put 5 guards on the floor and they, just around the horn, sort of outside the perimeter, kind of that 5-out offense. And so Yucatolu was alone down low, and he had to sort of step up towards the top of the key in order to defend that area. And if Canada was able to slash guards or cut guards down low towards the basket super quickly, sometimes Yucatolu was able to get back. Other times, because again, he has that long wingspan and that long stride, and he has those great rim protection abilities. So he's able to recover that lost step that he lost when he stepped up to the top of the key. He's able to get back in time, had a couple chase down blocks in that way. What sometimes happens, though, is those guards are just too quick. So that puts a little bit of pressure on Indiana's guards to defend the perimeter a little bit better. But it seems like largely it's fine for now. And we'll see if Big Ten teams and if college teams in Indiana's actual season, Arkansas, Syracuse, Kentucky, those major non-conference matchups, we'll see if they are able to exploit that specific process on defense for Indiana. And we'll see. And again, Indiana's trying things out in these games. This isn't the final form of Indiana that we're going to see. In some ways, DeVries was testing Samet's mobility, just trying to see what is he able to do, what can he do, what can he not on defense and offense, particularly on defense in this way. So there's a chance that that's never the defensive scheme or the defensive approach for DeVries, and Samet is never put in those positions against Big Ten teams. So I wouldn't necessarily freak out, or I wouldn't overly celebrate the successful moments considering the quality of Indiana's opponents in these matchups, and I wouldn't overly freak out about some of the mishaps and some of the the mistakes or the inefficiencies, because this isn't the real Indiana that we're going to see by the time this team actually plays. They don't even have all their players, on campus in uniform all the time in this, in the summer right now, in this, sort of Peru FISU America Games experience. Nonetheless, 2 bigs in that superior size has absolutely been a storyline. Also, the freshmen, right? You have Prince Alexander Moody, who was awesome, just an absolute star on all 3 levels, just a star on offense, great in transition too. Had some nice moments on defense as well. But Prince Alexander Moody is going to be a star for Indiana, and that was super impressive in the win against Canada a while back. And then the other night against Peru, I saw a lot of great things out of Von Carvalho, who I love. I'm just a huge fan of Von Carvalho. I love the confidence he plays with. I mean, right away, like first time playing in competitive action inside Assembly Hall, and Carvalho has a dunk in the first quarter against Canada. And again, there's the size advantage, but in transition, Carvalho is awesome. I like the way he defends. I like his versatility, the way he can play multiple positions, and I like the confidence he plays with on offense. Also, he's another example of someone who could be dunking it on one possession and could be firing a long-range triple on another. I like that a lot about Carvalho. Trevor Manhurst has had some success around the three-point line as well. It's another freshman that has contributed. DeVries said that the freshmen were going to contribute, and he was absolutely right. He was clearly correct. They're going to contribute probably this season in very meaningful minutes, even in the Big Ten. We'll see how the rotations shift and how the rotations tighten when we get to the actual season, but I'm confident that Prince Alexander Moody and Von Carvalho, at the very least, are going to play their way onto the floor in some capacity this season. Trent Sisley is someone else who's going to play his way onto the floor. Obviously, he was on the floor a great deal last season, and he's bigger and stronger now, and he seems like more of a force. He's a more enforcing player. He still has some of those youthful mistakes that we saw a year ago, but I still like I like even more his takes to the basket. I like his blocks. I love how physically present Trent Sisley seems to be compared to what he was last season. And then we look at another comparison between last season and this season, where triples just aren't as important as they were before. They are still important, very important, but they're not paramount. And Indiana has a lot of great three-point shooters on this team. That's obviously indicative of a DeVries offense. But last year they fully, in the full sense of the word, lived and died by the three, and I just don't think that's necessarily going to be the case this season in a very positive way. So there's more versatility, there's more balance, there's more distributed strength across the roster, right? We talked about Sherrill and Yigitolu, but even just guards driving to the basket, right? It's great to see this Indiana team have a little bit more balance in terms of the roster construction, and I think that's definitely the case based on what we've seen so far for this team. Marcus Burton at the point guard position is someone that is definitely trustworthy. I always seem to feel confident that he's going to put the ball in the right place, whether it's in his own hands on his way to the basket or, with a shot from outside. He's just unbelievably ingenious on a lot of those plays. On the way to the basket and from outside and across the board as a creator for his own shot and a creator of his own offense. But then also if he's passing the ball to someone else, I feel confident that he's going to put the ball in the right place. And that is it's a deep breath, right? And I wrote about Marcus Burton for Crimson Cast and mentioned how he's bringing deep breaths to Bloomington. It's just a deep breath when he has the ball. It's confidence that he's going to put the ball in the right place. He did it against Canada. He did it as far as we could tell against Peru. Again, the broadcast was rather choppy. He seems to be great as well. And then we talked about Aiden Sherrill. Jaden Mustaf is an example of one of those guards that can really drive to the basket. He had a couple dunks and drew some fouls and had some great moments, headed from high to low, headed from the top of the hill downhill, referring to the wing or the top of the key, down to the blocks and to the rim. So Mustaf, I think, is going to be awesome. We talked about the confidence that Carvalho is playing with. I think this Indiana men's basketball team is in a fantastic place moving forward, and we'll see how the season pans out. Right? Again, it's easy to say they're doing great when they won 98-64 against a school from Canada and 115-36 against school from Purdue. I imagine a similar result, probably somewhere in between those two against the Virgin Islands a little bit later on, and probably more similar blowout results in favor of the Hoosiers, or in this case, the Americans, once we reach the knockout stage as well, whether it's Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, whoever this team may face in those knockout stages a little bit later on in the tournament, a little bit later on in the week and the month. But they're in a good place so far, and those are some of my player and team takeaways. Hopefully we can do, I'm planning on doing the Andrew Garrison show. Next week is a very busy week. I'm planning on doing the Andrew Garrison show very soon, a quick turnaround, probably on Monday or Tuesday, because on Wednesday I'm going down to Big Ten Media Days in Chicago. Those two events will be, or that event will be on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. I'll be there on Wednesday and Thursday. Kurt Signetti and the Indiana players will speak on Thursday. So I'll be in Chicago for that. And then I come back, and then I'm going to go start moving into my house in Bloomington at some point this week. And then also the City League has its playoffs. So a very busy week on the back end of the week next week. I'm going to try to do a show earlier in the week as a result, because it's either early in the week or not at all. And I'd love to do a show, of course. So that is likely going to happen earlier on in the week next week. And in order to make that happen, or part of making that happen is then being able to talk about Indiana men's basketball a little bit more close to when the events actually are. So whether they've played knockout stages by then or not, we'll have to see how the schedule shakes out. Then Indiana is going to be in position to have played a game for me to discuss shortly after it happens, right? The day after, the second day after. I guess that's what this is, the second day after. But that way we're not just kind of having a catch-all, quick-fire, quick-hitter thoughts and takeaways. I can have a few more concentrated takeaways that I can really delve deeper into. That's the goal for the show next week if the scheduling works out. Obviously, I will let you all know what the situation is with that. Let's briefly talk about the World Cup. Spain won the World Cup, and I'll take another sip of this sparkling water before we get going. But to preview the segment, Spain won the World Cup, and the Women's World Cup I think is going to be awesome in 2027. I'm looking forward to talking about both. Okay, so Spain won the World Cup, and this probably isn't overly surprising. I'm sure this is a team that was considered a contender, but it's surprising to me because of my experience with Spain in World Cup history, right? And I think that's a little bit different than a lot of people. If you're over the age of, I'd say 25 probably, then you have a different experience of Spain's international soccer history than I do, and I'd love to discuss that because I think my perspective is similar to those of people my age, but obviously most people on Earth aren't my age. Most people on Earth are older than me, so most people have a different experience with Spain over the course of history. The reason why I bring this up, Spain won the World Cup, and that was kind of unthinkable to me, even though Spain has always been a true contender and has been one of those top teams and has been a team that people discuss as a potential champion each and every World Cup cycle. This year, the country actually did it. So I was born in 2006, right? I'm 19 years old, and I'll turn 20 in November, And so the 2010 World Cup, which Spain won, I was 4 years old, or maybe 5. I was very young during. And obviously, the reason why I say that is the fact that I don't remember it. I don't think I even watched it. I'm sure it was on in my house, but I don't have memories of the 2010 World Cup. Spain won that World Cup, and I didn't even know that. I didn't I'm sure I knew that for a while, but I obviously forgot that fact. And then that's kind of was returned to my brain when Spain was in the final. I was even doing research for this segment, looking back at World Cup history, and didn't even realize that Spain had won the World Cup in 2010. So they win the World Cup in 2010, but I don't remember that. So most people on Earth, when they think of World Cup history, they do think of Spain winning in 2010. That's in South Africa, right? That's a moment in recent World Cup history, but it's not one that I'm familiar with because my first World Cup was the 2014 World Cup. Obviously, I've consumed a lot of all of the World Cups. I've experienced now 4 World Cups in my lifetime that I was actually consciously aware of and paying attention to, and all 4 of those World Cups, but mainly the 3 leading up to 2026. In all of those World Cups, Spain was viewed by me as a team that is great, right, and a team that could win the championship and is capable of that, is capable of going on a deep run, but a team that is going to get clipped early. Not necessarily that they're going to blow it or that they don't have the gas to get through the knockout stage, but just that they'll get clipped early. Much like how with England, every year in every World Cup, I look at England as a team that could win the World Cup, but I also look at the team that is probably going to blow it. And in the same way that it would be not wild, but in the same way that it would be a little bit alarming to actually see England win the World Cup and go all the way, in the same way that seeing that would just feel strange because you've built up the perception in your mind that England's just always going to blow it. If they did actually get over the hump this time around, or if they do in 2030 or in another future World Cup, it'll feel weird to actually see that nation actually bring it home, right? Because for years we've seen that team get close or have a chance and then blow it. Much like how it would be strange to see the Cowboys win the Super Bowl for similar reasons, or to see Texas win the national championship, for example, in these next few years, or Oklahoma or someone like that. We're used to them being in contention. We're used to them being there in the playoffs or in the very ends of the season or in the knockout stage of the World Cup in this situation, but we're not used to them actually getting over the top and doing it. And that is accentuated by the facts that in 2014, Spain got grouped. I believe it was the Netherlands and Chile who advanced over Spain in the World Cup that year. So in 2014, Spain wasn't even in the knockout stage. So that's a team that was great that got clipped early. In 2018, Spain did advance to the round of 16, but they lost in penalties to the host nation, Russia. And then in 2022, they advanced to the round of 16, but lost in the round of 16 to Morocco in penalties again. So in both of those nations, I might add, I mean, I don't know for sure, but I'm fairly certain that Russia was ranked lower than Spain in the FIFA World Rankings in 2018. And I'm fairly certain, even though Morocco is one of the better teams in Africa, that Morocco was also ranked lower. And even if Morocco was ranked higher at that time, Morocco is one of the best countries in Africa, whereas Spain is one of the best countries in Europe. And just factually, Europe is universally understood to be better at soccer, at football, at whatever else, than the entire continent of Africa. So it's more impressive to be the best team in Europe than it is to be the best team in Africa. Even if Morocco is better than Spain, there's still that perception that they got clipped in an upset, right? And so whether or not that is actually identified as an upset in 2022 or even in 2018 is not necessarily the point here. It's just the fact that Spain, this international power, was clipped early. Not saying that it was an upset or that Morocco in 2022 was bad. They obviously went to the semifinals. Neither am I saying that about Russia. They were obviously the hosts. It was likely for them to make a deep run. But grouped and then, out in groups, out in the round of 16 in penalties, and then out in the round of 16 in penalties. That is my memory of Spain men's international soccer. And so in 2026, to see them actually go on the run and then beat France and then beat Argentina, the Messi team of destiny, the team that I thought was a team of destiny in Argentina, to see them actually get over the hump and do that is a little bit jarring and a little bit alarming, just for my nervous system, which is used to experiencing Spain be awesome and have great games. I think the best soccer game I've ever seen still to this day is the 2018 group stage matchup between Spain and Portugal, which was a draw, 3-3. Ronaldo and that Spain team, it was just fantastic, and that set up for a crazy group situation where Spain and Portugal tied at the top of the group with 5 points, and then, if I remember correctly, Iran had 4 points and Morocco had 1. And there was a real world where if there weren't, necessarily, I guess the draws elsewhere, Iran and Morocco each drew. I don't remember exactly who drew who. Maybe Morocco and Portugal and Iran and Spain, if I remember correctly, but I'm not sure. Either way, both Portugal and Spain obviously had 2 draws. One of them was against each other, and one of them was against one of those teams that was less likely to win the group. But if either one of those is a loss, then there was totally a world where Spain gets grouped again, or Portugal gets grouped with Ronaldo in a time period when Ronaldo and Portugal winning the World Cup was a little bit more likely, at least, to my brain. At the time I was in something like 6th grade, or entering 6th grade, I believe, in 2018 at the time of that World Cup in Russia. So that's just the Spain I remember. So them actually winning it is a little bit jarring. The best comparison is England. England would be even more so because I'm used to them completely blowing it, whereas Spain, I'm used to them just, or even maybe it's more alarming with Spain because they're not even really, again, they've prior to this point had never been in the quarterfinals in my conscious lifetime, much less the semifinals or the final. So to see them not only advance that far and then actually win it is interesting because now, from this point forward, when I think of Spain, I'll think of them winning the World Cup in 2026, at least within an international men's soccer context. And whereas for my entire life, I've thought about them as a team that's great but gets clipped early. And that's interesting to me. I'll briefly talk about the Women's World Cup because I think it deserves it. 2027, the Women's World Cup is going to be in Brazil. I think that's super worth watching. It's on Netflix, which is a shame, and it's just unfortunate. And so I hope that it doesn't lose viewership because it's on a streaming service or because it's behind a paywall, right? Whereas this World Cup was on Fox in America, and it was easy to watch for everybody. We'll see what that does, but I think I'll totally get whether it's a free trial or I'll just pay for it for a few months. I think I'll totally get Netflix for the Women's World Cup. It's in Brazil, which is a storyline in its own right because Brazil did a great job hosting the 2014 World Cup. I think most of us are more familiar with men's World Cups in history than the Women's World Cup. So the 2014 World Cup could be nostalgia for people my age. Brazil hosting a World Cup, therefore, is somewhat nostalgic, and I think it could be in 2027 on the women's side. Spain won the last Women's World Cup. That would have been in 2023, so the Spain title defense is an interesting storyline. The U.S. in that tournament lost to Sweden in the round of 16, so it's sort of a revenge tour for the Americans if they have it in them, which will be very interesting. The other thing nice about this World Cup for me is that by the way, background for me on the Women's World Cup. I watched pretty much the entire, every single match of the 2019 World Cup in France. And then I guess I watched none of the 2023 World Cup. I just don't have memories of it. I don't remember the U.S. losing. I don't remember Spain winning. I remember everything about 2019. I remember nothing about 2023. I don't know what I was doing in 2023. I guess not watching the Women's World Cup. And so my memory of international women's soccer is all messed up, right? Because I'm thinking 8 years ago when most people are thinking 4 years ago in terms of these women's international sides. But I want to watch this World Cup a lot because, first of all, I obviously still have this lingering World Cup fever from the men's tournament, but also, again, it's in Brazil. The Spain title defense storyline is interesting. The USA losing to Sweden and potentially having a revenge tour here. By the way, losing in the round of 16 is after winning it in 2019. That is an interesting storyline as well. Also, the U.S., for me, as someone who lives in the U.S., the U.S. can actually win the Women's World Cup, whereas on the men's side, it's pretty much relatively impossible given just the strength elsewhere in the world. Also, what's nice for me is that there's the lead up to the World Cup. Whereas on the men's side, and this is different from years past, right? In past World Cups, I've been interested in the World Cup. I've followed the qualifiers, all the way through. This time around, I didn't watch the qualifiers at all, didn't think about the qualifiers, didn't even pull up the Wikipedia pages, didn't think about the World Cup almost once until the week it started, and then I was all on board. I was ready to go. I was happy with it. Once it started and the games were on and I knew who was good and what the storylines were, I was on board and I loved it. But what's nice about the Women's World Cup is I have the Men's World Cup to put me on notice and remind me, oh yeah, the Women's World Cup is coming up. And it's more likely that I'll follow the qualifiers a little bit more closely, both in CONCACAF and across the board. The U.S., by the way, I believe on November 27th, you will have to check that, but definitely in November, the U.S. continues its qualification process against El Salvador. I say right now in July that I will be interested in watching those qualifiers or at least paying attention to them. Once we're in the middle of football season and the start of men's basketball season and women's basketball season, it might be much less likely that I actually do follow through on that. But certainly when the World Cup comes around next summer, I'll be very fascinated in witnessing this U.S. team compete in each and every one of those matchups in the group stage and the knockout stage and beyond. Also, it's fun because new teams are niche, right? Nigeria is great in women's soccer, whereas it doesn't usually qualify for the World Cup on the men's side, at least in recent World Cup history. There are other examples. North Korea is the 11th best nation in the world, last time I checked, according to the FIFA World Rankings. That's fascinating. Jamaica, if I remember correctly, is a real contender in CONCACAF. They kind of are on the men's side too, but they've never actually broken through to the tournament at large. There are more examples that I wish I could think of off the top of my head, but there are teams on the women's side that are more so contenders, those niche teams that are niche on the men's side because they never qualify for the World Cup, whereas the women's side, they're mostly mainstays, especially now that World Cup has expanded from 24 teams to 32. And that's the one last benefit of the World Cup is if you didn't like the third place stuff with the Men's World Cup this past year with 48 teams, and if you thought it was complicated the way the round of 32 shook out, the Women's World Cup is 32 teams, just like old times. So you can appreciate that format on the women's side. Whereas it used to be 24 teams, and it was a mini version of the third place mess that I felt like this Men's World Cup struggled with. Not that the expansion was bad, it's just that my brain likes clean cut. The top two teams qualify. Exactly that Group A, the winner of Group A is going to play the second place team in Group B, and so on. We get that experience with the Women's World Cup next year, and that'll be fun and interesting. I should get out of here because I got to go to the City League in just a few minutes. So I got to, pack up all this podcast stuff and pack up the broadcast stuff and take it downtown towards Indianapolis. I appreciate you all for watching and or listening to this episode of The Andrew Garrison Show. We should be back early next week. If we're not, hopefully late next week. If not, then the week after that, as we get ready for an exciting time in August. July is wrapping up. Football season is really coming up quick. So is basketball season as well. It's going to be a dead sprint through football and basketball season this fall and winter, and I look forward to you all joining me on that exciting ride. Thank you so much for watching and or listening to The Andrew Garrison Show. I will speak to you all next time.